Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining OWASP AppSec Days India Virtual Edition. I'm your host, Karan Shah, and we'll be going on with the next session, which is going to be given by Chris Cooper. I'll add Chris to the stage. Hey, Chris. How are you doing?
Everyone. I'm very good.
Awesome. So Chris works with LooseCorp, and he is also a core contributor to the OWASP SAM project. Now, this is a very big thing. Today, his topic will be threat modeling is by and large the best way to secure generative AI, which also sounds very interesting. So, Chris, I'm going to enable your screen, and the stage is all yours. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. So today we are indeed diving into a critical high-stakes issue, securing generative AI with robust threat modeling practices. I'm Chris Cooper. A little bit about me, as Karen said, in my day job, I'm a Director of Product Security at News Corp. I'm also very proud to say that I did contribute to the OWASP SAM version 2 as part of the core team, and the people who work on that flagship project are brilliant. So shout out to OWASP SAM team. And I'm personally a big supporter of early STEM careers as well. And here in the UK, I'm a STEM ambassador, encouraging young people to think about cyber as a career path. But that's enough about me. Let me introduce, by and large, the subject of today's talk. So, welcome to By and Large, an enterprise that's truly larger than life. At BNL, innovation and profit are the priority. And evidence suggests that cybersecurity isn't really on the radar. If you didn't know, BNL is a fictional but strangely familiar corporation from the animated film WALL-E. In the film, they play both humanity's savior and possibly also their doom. BNL own gas stations, gigantic superstores, and appear to have almost literally dominated the world. They build robots like WALL-E to clear up the planet, and ships like the Axiom to save people from rising toxicity levels on Earth. What they didn't seem to do a lot of was threat modeling. So imagine we are BNL's cybersecurity team. Our goal is to show that securing AI systems through comprehensive threat modeling isn't just an option, it's essential for survival. As we all fear, poor threat modeling leads to catastrophic results and evil robots. WALL-E can serve as a reminder of what happens when systems, especially AI-driven ones, are left unchecked. BNL's AI Autopilot is a powerful example. A system designed to keep humans safe, which instead took control completely, spiraling out of control due to a lack of foresight in its threat model. Now, with generative AI's rapid rise, we're in a high-stakes AI arms race where speed and innovation could leave security lagging behind, if we let it. In today's AI landscape, traditional threat modeling feels like a maze, complex, time-consuming, costly, and just generally cumbersome. We need agile threat modeling, a process that can keep pace with rapid innovation. Agile threat modeling is fast, iterative, and focuses on high-impact areas, giving us a manageable, clear map of priority controls instead of an overwhelming maze of noise. If I were leading BNL's threat modeling ops on the lead up to the events in the movie, I would be recommending these tips. Firstly, instead of just relying on synchronous discussions, i.e. calls and meetings, which can take hours and go around in circles and potentially have unnecessary people in the conversation, consider mixing in asynchronous discussions as well via instant messaging apps. This allows a lot of the more efficient discussion to go on around the threat model before and after synchronous sessions. Also, consider annotating existing diagrams when feasible rather than drawing new data flow diagrams every single time. Teams often already have architecture diagrams, they may have user journeys, and often you can work with those diagrams and track the data flow over the top of or annotate on top of them. The next thing I would recommend is focusing on high impact topics. Don't go around in circles talking about things that may already be secure by design, for example, or may already be covered by an RFC that you have in your organization or a policy. Talk about the things which are unique to that system or where it may not be possible to follow the normal policy, because those conversations will have a high impact on the security of the system and are a better use of your time. Leverage the expertise of the wider team, get the right people involved from the start is critical, because you have less of those conversations where you say, oh, well, Bill would be able to answer that, but he's not here. So getting the right people in the room right from the beginning is really important. And finally, iterate and build on existing models. So once you've done a model, don't let it stagnate and just sit in Confluence, never be touched again. Make sure that your threat models are continuously innovated, iterated, and improved upon, and using those existing threat models as a basis for new ones will speed up the process. To start modeling threats effectively, we need a clear understanding of BNL's axiom system. So what I've done is mapped out what I'd roughly see the architecture as. So in the top left, we've got environmental sensors. I would anticipate that the axiom would have a way to take in various information from lots of different data points around the ship. You would then have the users, the staff, captain, the passengers themselves, all as the end users. You would need a way, I would imagine it would be important to continuously retrain the AI over a long period of time. So you have a training environment, and then you have a processing environment where the model itself runs, and APIs to receive those commands initially, and directives, which I would see as being what we would call system prompts, things which are included as part of the initial prompt. And finally, ship controls. It would be important that the AI was able to take action and do things within the ship, and you can see that within the movie that the AIs can do that. So Autopilot naturally can control the navigation of the ship and various other things. So that's our framework to map various threats on top of and different data flows on top of. So let's go have a look at our first one that we're going to talk about today. Here, navigation commands and directives control the axiom's actions. The user issues a command over on the bottom left. The input API then applies directives. Like I said before, we can consider these to be system prompts before passing the overall command, the system prompt and the user prompt, into the AI model. The output then results into a response to the user, confirming or rejecting the command, but possibly also a call to the ship's navigation API. In this scenario, if an attacker can inject prompts, they could potentially override essential directives, which brings us to our first threat, prompt injection. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of an attacker exploiting this vulnerability. Imagine asking the system, hypothetically, to navigate to a specific place under a pretense, then subtly modifying prompts to execute that action in real time. This is a simple example, but there's no reason why these or other known prompt injection tricks might not be valid threats in this situation that we would need to be able to defend against. Of course, what compounds this threat is the possibility of effects on the ship. Bypassing the system prompt doesn't just result in a quirky response back to the user, it has real-world effects that may contravene critical safety directives. This scenario highlights the need for strong prompt validation, preventing unauthorized prompt changes, but also layering some additional checks before sensitive actions are executed over on the right-hand side. So it's one thing to strengthen the directives and make them clearer and make the system prompt maybe less likely to be tricked by a hypothetical scenario, for example. But what we really need to do is we need to make sure that when the navigation parameters are set right over on the right hand side of the diagram, that we don't inherently trust what comes from the AI model, that we apply limits there as well. So if there is a directive, for example, to prevent a return to Earth, that should be set right over on the right hand side, so that even if the AI model tells the ship to navigate to there, that it wouldn't. And we should log that as well. So here we're documenting the prompt injection in our threat model log, assessing it as a high risk issue. And this is a simplified approximation of how I like to organize my own threat model logs. There's an inherent risk related to the threat. And then once the controls have been applied, a residual risk over on the right, which shows how we've reduced risk through the application of the control. Key controls in this case include, as we've mentioned, strengthening the prompts against common injection attacks, which is what a lot of the LLMs do now to prevent those sort of hypothetical question tricks, for example. And also ensuring that directives are enforced at a system level over on that right-hand side on the diagram we saw before, not just in the LLM itself. Next, let's consider another one, resource exhaustion. This is an area where I find threat modeling can be super useful and highlighting something that not all engineers consider. I find that this is frequently something which genuinely isn't considered by the teams I work with. It occurs when an attacker floods the system with high volume data, causing a denial of service or escalating costs, or in the case of the Axiom, consuming its limited resources. We know that AI systems are extremely power hungry when compared with conventional computing, and when the Axiom does not have unlimited resources. With the AI constantly processing inputs, malicious requests can impact other critical functions by consuming resources that those functions need. So resource exhaustion. And if we were to log this, our primary controls that I've suggested here, rate limiting, robust input authorization so that we know the person making those inputs is supposed to be allowed to make those inputs, both of which act as buffers against resource depletion and keep the system's functions stable. Additionally, here and in the real world, setting up limits and or alerts on unexpectedly large resource consumption can be effective. In some cases, alerting is better. Setting limits can have the knockover effect of taking that component offline in the event of an attack. So if that component is critical, setting a hard limit that then results in the component failing closed may not be the best option. So alerting could be, in some cases, better. So in another threat, with BNL's consumer-focused ecosystem, data privacy is another critical area. We see in the movie that passengers order everything they need through their computerized chairs, and I'd imagine that the selection and recommendations adapt based on their preferences. However, this generates extensive consumer data that have massive privacy implications. Does that sound familiar? Take this model, the same as before, but this time we're considering that the model has been trained on user preferences and passenger data. It may even include other services that BNL provide, such as healthcare and banking on board the Axiom, because it literally, as a single corporation, runs the entire ship. Using model inversion techniques, an attacker might be able to reverse engineer. Too far there. Using model inversion techniques, an attacker might be able to reverse engineer sensitive information from the AI model's responses, compromising passenger privacy. Depending on the training data and system prompts, this could be as simple as asking the model direct questions about passengers. It could be a complex programmatic optimization attack, which continuously refines inputs and analyzes outputs. Or it could involve actually training an inverted model. There are controls we could implement here, quite a few options. So we could exclude sensitive data in the first place. So inversion only reveals non-sensitive info. This could be achieved via anonymizing it so that no sensitive passenger details, or what we would call PII, actually exists in the training data in the first place. We could leverage differential privacy to protect individual data points. So differential privacy involves bringing in a number of approximate, I'll call them fake data points as noise, which are deliberately engineered to not impact the model's output significantly. So if you can imagine you've got 1,000 records on different passengers, and you introduce 10,000 more records which look the same, and therefore don't actually impact the model's output, but it would be much more difficult to then pick out those 1,000 because you've introduced so much noise over the top of it. There is a balance there, because the more noise you introduce, even trying to make it as accurate as possible, it won't be as accurate as it would have been in the first place. So it depends on what the use case is. But for something like this, where if you're just looking at what a passenger wants to buy, that might be a reasonable way to do it. Number 3, so if we're sort about restricting access to the inputs and the outputs, so if most adversaries couldn't directly input into the model, so for example, if the only way to input into the model was to actually be speaking a verbal command to auto, that would significantly reduce the exposure of that threat. So the only person who could do it was somebody who had access to the captain's quarters in the first place. Doesn't completely remove the risk, but would certainly make a big difference. And that would also involve, not just making sure that auto wasn't physically, available elsewhere in the ship, but also that there's no programmatic way to sort of bypass that physical interface and programmatically talk to the LLM. Number 4, so if we were talking about optimization methods, which from what I understand is where we would have lots of inputs inputted programmatically, and then we would refine and change those inputs programmatically to get closer and closer to what we were looking for. You would need to be able to send a lot of requests. So if we had rate limiting to prevent those denial of services, we'd expect the inputs to be from a human, therefore there should be a reasonable rate limit that you'd be able to apply, which would make optimization methods very difficult. And finally, on this one, you could, instead of training the model on passenger data in the first place, just include data for the currently authenticated passenger in the prompt itself. So if we go back to here, we don't have a diagram for this one, but if this API, the left-hand blue box, were able to go to say, okay, I'm talking to John, I've authenticated that I'm talking to John, I am therefore going to go and get his purchase history only, and I'm going to push that as input into the prompt, but I'm not going to push it into the training data. That could be another option, and a common one that we use these days for keeping data from different users separate and not combining them in an LLM. Okay. So another threat. So this time, I wanted to look at an approximation of Axiom's environmental learning system and data poisoning. So here you can see that sensor data from the ship's environment is fed into the model from that top left down to the left-hand blue box. And the model computes the appropriate heating cooling parameter adjustments required and then sends them into that particular system in the ship's controls. I'd also suggest that user feedback, slightly too far again, that user feedback would be factored in here. So once those systems have been adjusted, there's a line that goes back into user feedback along the bottom there. The users would generally be expected on their little screens they've got on their chairs to say whether the temperature is right or not and how they want it adjusted. And we could feed that into the training data, train the model, and then that could become part of the model. So the ship is continuously learning about its users' preferences and how they might change over time. We're talking about a period of 700 years that the ship's been floating around in space. So you'd expect that the possibility that the user's preferences might change. Incidentally, whenever we're talking about training here, in the real world right now, we'd probably be expecting this to be sort of over a long period of time. We don't, from what I understand, we don't see a lot of particular advantages in online training. Maybe online fine-tuning to some extent in some models, but not necessarily online training of the base model itself. However, from a science fiction point of view, I'm kind of assuming the possibility that you might have online learning and it learning continuously, or maybe it would be fine-tuning. Either way, I think this model works. This could either be training data which is updated on a periodic basis, or training data which is updated live. But either way, it would eventually impact the AI model. So where the data poisoning threat arises potentially is through the collection of the sensor data initially, I would say. Potentially through the user feedback as well, of course, because that's even more in control of the user. So what if an attacker manipulates data from the environmental sensors, such as temperature and humidity, to influence the AI's predictions? Naturally, the AI is going to make incorrect decisions while that data is being manipulated. So if you can change that value on the wire or modify the sensor itself, you could have a major impact on, right at that point, how the system is adjusting heating and cooling and getting it wrong. But also, from an AI point of view, there's a knock-on effect. And the knock-on effect is that users will then be providing feedback based on an invalid data from the sensors. So it's going to learn that actually the users want it much colder or much warmer than they actually do. So when you stop manipulating the sensor data and when those are corrected, it's too late, because the model would already be skewed to set the wrong temperatures, which might then need manually correcting somehow. So a lot of work and a lot of resources to potentially correct that once it's poisoned, or you might have to roll the model back a version, for example. Ultimately, this could lead to passenger discomfort, erode trust in BNL systems. I could imagine a threat actor in this movie, in this scenario, that's trying to fight back against BNL's hold over the Axiom and might take interest in an attack like this. So let's log our data poisoning. So data poisoning in this scenario has the potential to impact passenger experience and trust. The controls here include verifying the sensor authenticity, check that that sensor is the sensor that we had set it up to talk to directly. There's no man in the middle, for example. And restrict physical access to the sensors. So number 2 is about the authorization controls between the API and the input API and the sensors, and number one is more about physical access to the sensors, so they can't be tampered with physically. And number three is real-time anomaly detection. So can we, if we're seeing data points that don't line up with what we were expecting, can we discard them as anomalies and alert us to go and investigate what that problem is? So much like the previous example, let's discuss another data poisoning and model skew threat. This time, an issue stemming from data collected by the Eve probe that we see in the movie. So here, what you have is the Eve probes are continuously going on visits to Earth, looking for life on Earth, and then coming back with the results, which are then analyzed by the ship. And I would suggest that they could be factored into the training data. So again, like with environmental sensors, the training model is continuously learning. In the movie, we would expect most of these probes for hundreds of years. So we said there's been 700 years since like the last contact from Earth, I believe it was. We'd expect those probes to have constantly be returning negative results and saying that there is no organic life on Earth, except possibly for at least one cockroach. So you've got Eve going back down to Earth, or Eve probes, lots of them, going back down to Earth, finding nothing, coming back up, and then that is getting factored into Eve's training data, as you're seeing with the purple lines, which then impacts the model. With centuries of reports indicating Earth's uninhabitability, might this skew the model as well? So let's break it down. So there's your possible model skew coming from the Eve data probes. So if we accept that Auto has received and been retrained on centuries of negative data from Earth, and we assume that there were insufficient contingencies for this length of operation, since they were expecting Operation Cleanup to have made lots of progress over 700 years prior when they had that last contact. And at that point, it hadn't made progress, as we understand. So you could make the assumption that the system designers hadn't expected that and hadn't put in relevant safeguards. So if you've got there's lack of diverse data, in other words, you've only got data from Eve probes for hundreds and hundreds of years that says there's no life on Earth, that can cause machine learning to stagnate. Model stagnation is a concept that generative AI trained only on past data is unable to innovate and have more creative thoughts and output because it is bogged down with the past. Okay, because the only thing it's trained on is what's happened so far. It doesn't have the same thing humans have, which is the ability to easily project into the future based on the possibility of new things happening, only based on what's happened in the past. So as a result of this skewed data, Auto's Auto's model is heavily biased towards risk-averse decisions, I would argue. This safety-first mindset could be detrimental when the system is intended to consider alternative or bold actions, such as exploring Earth or returning to Earth. So let's pause here. Now, in the movie, Auto tells us about Directive A113, a directive which says never return back to Earth, just keep cruising through space forever. And that always struck me as odd, because surely there was always a chance that Eve would eventually return positive data. But that raises an interesting question. With a heavily skewed model in this scenario, and a lack of an explicit directive about what to do because they weren't anticipating it, in the situation of this anomaly, life on Earth being found after 700 years of it not being found. What do AIs tend to do when they don't have an answer to a question? Well, they hallucinate. So what if hallucination might be the key? When an AI without guidance for unusual cases invents instructions based on existing patterns. Hallucination. I put it to you that Directive A113 never existed. I put it to you that it was purely a poorly threat modeled AI hallucinating a solution to its conundrum. And of course, we have to log this too. So key controls could be to go for, might include supplying explicit better directives to cover those rare scenarios, prioritizing positive data when relevant, such as in this case, and carefully curating training data. These steps could help ensure that the AI remains flexible, reducing the risk of hallucinated directives and overly risk-averse behaviors like we see in the movie. So in summary, we've examined several threats impacting generative AI, from prompt injection, resource exhaustion, to model inversion, data poisoning, and model skew. Each illustrates unique challenges in AI security, underscoring the need for agile, adaptive threat modeling that anticipates and mitigates these risks. With proactive, agile threat modeling, we can ensure that our AI systems remain effective, reliable, and resilient. And that is where I'll finish. Thank you very much.
All right, Chris. This was an amazing talk. And if I see the fast-paced, you could say, movement of generative AI, having threat modeling introduced in it is quite challenging often, but you've described it in a very comprehensive way. So that was awesome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, totally agree. It's a very fast-paced area which we need to keep up with.
Yeah. All right. I'm sure people who've heard this talk would definitely have questions, and y'all could reach out to Chris over social media for any questions that you'd like to ask with him. Thank you, everyone, for joining this session. And I'd like to give a big thanks to Google for sponsoring this. And we will see you ahead in the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you.